Hi, I'm Amy.
And I'm Kirsty, and this is our podcast, Love Needs No Words. Hello and welcome to Love Needs No Words. Today we are joined by Jaqueline Parkinson, who runs Magnificent Munchers. Magnificent Munchers provide food therapy and support for children who eat a limited range of food, and they are also very proud to be neurodiverse friendly. Welcome, Jaqueline.
Thank you. Nice to meet you both.
Oh, we are really pleased to have you on because let us tell you that we have been asked so often by people who listen to this podcast for support on the topic of fussy eating and difficulties with eating for children who have disabilities and neurodiversity. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. So I guess a great place to start is, can you tell us a little bit more about Magnificent Munchers, what you do and what kind of motivated you to start supporting families with children who are fussy eaters?
Yeah, so I started about 2014 really. So I was working as a children's OT in St Albans, just sort of doing general OT stuff. And we used to run sensory workshops. I think it's the same system now, that if you were referred for sensory difficulties, you came to a workshop run by the OTs. And eating just kept coming up and up and up. And we knew how to deal with like cutlery skills and things like that, but actually like this food sensitivities wasn't really dealt with. So I was like, we need to do something about this. Kids coming up. So anyway, I was allowed to go on a course, which was the SOS approach that I use in Ireland. I came back really motivated, excited, like, we've got to do this. And anyway, long story short, I managed to get a little bit of it going. And then the trust run a Dragon's Den competition. Never done it before, never done it since, I don't think. And so I entered and I won. Oh, and I didn't get any money personally, but, I was allowed to set up the groups, really. So I got £5,000. So I had to recruit a dietitian, psychologist, OT assistant, speech language therapist. So, but it was made very clear that I wasn't even allowed to call it a pilot. It was just a piece of work, really. So we ran the groups for about 3 months and got really good results. And I was all fired up, and my dragon was a dietitian, so she was really excited. And then unfortunately my daughter was really ill and I took 6 months off work. So when I came back, I was like, oh, can we get started? So it's like, no, you just got to do regular OT. And I think it's like everything, when you're faced with some things in life, you make life-changing decisions. Yeah. So I decided that I loved it and I was going to start it up. So I recruited my own speech and language therapist and dietitian and some assistants and kind of set it up, and was still in the NHS. And then it got to the point where it was so busy, I needed to decide what I was going to do, really. So I gave up the NHS and started Munchers. So yeah, so now we've been going by ourselves now for about 8 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we do, so there's a team, there's me, I'm an occupational therapist, speech and language therapist, dietitian, and then I've got 2 therapy assistants. And we have a first aider who I contract out, who does first aid session, our training, but also for parents. So we run groups for 4 to 10-year-olds. That's like an 11-week program in Frogmore and St Albans. That's 6 children in a group. So our approach is very much about working with the child, but also working with the parent. So each week they get talks from me or one of the team members. They observe what we're doing with the children, and then towards the end of the group, they become the therapist and kind of put into action everything that they've learned with us over those weeks. So it's really interactive. We only have 6 children, 1 to 2 staff ratios, so can really support the parents and the child as well. Yeah, it's lots of fun. And then we do mini munchers. That's for 2 to 4-year-olds. So that's just a 6-week program. And again, the parents, rather than get talks in person from me every week because they've got toddlers, I do some online sessions for the parents of that one. And then I do home visits, and I also do Zoom sessions. So I do Zoom support for parents of children under 7. So they send me videos of meal times. Everyone that comes through our service fills in a food diary, and that's analysed by our dietitian. And then for the Zoom advice, I have 2 sessions with parents, giving them sort of strategies and stuff. And then I do Zoom therapy with children over 7. So yeah,
that's amazing. Gosh, you do
lots of
lots.
options.
You're
Yeah.
a busy lady. But I'm not surprised that you're so in demand because,
No.
I mean, as I said earlier, we've been contacted a lot. And I know just from personal experience how many people, even, not just children who are kind of on the spectrum or, have neurodiversity, how many children or how many parents actually are finding it difficult because their children are just not eating as they kind of expected that they might.
Yeah. I mean, this is a big question. What are the causes of fussy eating?
It's like everything, isn't it? It's all different reasons, really. I think when parents contact us, the very first thing parents often say, oh, I know I've done something wrong, or it's my fault. And I think as parents, that's always quite often our starting point, isn't it? What have I done wrong? It must be me. So I think the first important thing is it's not the parents' fault. There's a whole variety of reasons. So children are programmed to be fussy, and that's part of us kind of our development, really. So around 18 months, 2 years, we hit the kind of neophobic stage where that's kind of there. That fear of new things and fear of food is there to protect us, because we would go out around that age and start sort of back to our cavemen, start and foraging and things like that. So we don't want to be picking up things that we don't trust and put them into our mouths. So it's kind of there to protect us, and that we kind of just think that stays with children. But if you think like it stays with us into adulthood. So I think the time I'm always reminded of that is quite often when I go on holiday. And I think calamari is one of those foods that you order and you're like, right, calamari, that should be in a ring, in breadcrumbs, deep fried. And then lo and behold, you get like a thing that looks like an octopus on your plate and you're just like,
Yeah.
That's not what I was expecting. So that kind of fear factor kicks in. And I think that's how to try and encourage parents to think of it like that as well. So it's there to protect us. And things like that look slimy are quite often could be signs that something's off. So again, that's nature's way of protecting us. So things like, mushrooms, like cooked mushrooms and fried courgettes and things like that look slimy. Children don't want to eat because, again, it might be off. So there is a kind of sort of natural thing there. Some children have a more neophobic response than others. Again, that kind of makes sense because we needed people to go and test things, and then we needed people to be more sensitive. So I think then you throw in everyone's got an individual sensory system. Some people's sensory system is more heightened than others. And eating, you're using all your senses. So if you've got a more heightened sensory system, then things are going to be more difficult. And then you've got things like genetic links. You've got, we see a lot of children who have had allergies, maybe diagnosed quite late. So then they have quite naturally a fear of food. We have some children who have had a severe stomach bug or diarrhea or something like that. So that kind of negative trauma-y thing attached to food can quite often be a trigger. We have children who've had choking episodes and then they're worried. So there's not one particular, because I think, again, sometimes as parents, we want to know what is the one thing that caused this. It's lots of different factors, really. So I wouldn't say there's one particular thing. It's a combination of things, really. Yeah.
You mentioned about, obviously, all of us have different sort of sensory systems, and some people are more heightened than others. We've been contacted quite a few times by parents of neurodivergent children who are trying to kind of get support for their children who have restrictive diets. Obviously, the sensory link and neurodiversity is obviously understood, but in terms of restrictive eating, is there a clear link between neurodivergent children and restrictive diets?
If you think about it, it makes sense that if you've got autism or part of that is that you have a more sensitive sensory system. Eating, you're using all your senses, like we just talked about. Your sight is the initial one usually, isn't it? Like, does this look what I'm expecting it to look like? You use all your senses when eating. So it kind of makes sense that if you're struggling or more sensitive sensory wise, that eating and food may be something that you find difficult. And then I think as well, it's a lot of children with autism, it's the need for things to be the same. changing is difficult, the need for structure, the need routine. So again, with food, it's got to be the same, it's got to be consistent. If you change it, I'm struggling with that. So I think there are definitely links, but it's not to say that every child with autism is going to have an eating difficulty, or that every child with an eating difficulty is autistic.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it can be the thing that makes people investigate further. I think because that's the thing you probably go to the health visitor about first. It's like, my child's, I can't get them to eat a variety of foods. They seem to be really fixated on this. So I think sometimes it's the food difficulties that trigger other investigations. Yeah. I mean, in my personal experience, in our groups, so we have, I'm thinking of the food school for the 4 to 10-year-olds. We have 6 children. There's nearly always one child with autism in that group. So that kind of shows you statistics that we see. We see children with ADHD as well, probably not as common as children with autism. So there's usually 1 or 2 children diagnosed. And I think in mini munchers, sometimes we see children who haven't quite got that diagnosis who are probably going to head for that diagnosis. So I think, in our experience, we definitely see that correlation.
Yeah.
But,
I'm really interested as well. So, you mentioned that you have a dietitian and you also have a speech and language therapist.
Yeah.
Perhaps for people listening, a speech and language therapist might not be an obvious link to fussy eating. What's the logic behind having a speech and language therapist as part of your team?
So 2 reasons, really. So one, if we've got a child that, say, was just eating a pureed diet, we would be worried about, is there a mechanical issue for that?
Okay.
So she would look at the more mechanics of eating. And so sometimes we do joint assessments, and especially if you've got a child with kind of developmental issues and things like that. So that's her role within the team there. And then she talks to our parents about communication at meal times, because that's a biggie, really. And so she does a whole session with our parents on our groups about the communication, really.
And is that, when you say communication, that the language that's used around food and when they're eating?
Yeah, the language, like verbal, non-verbal, all those things, really. So she it's interesting. The discussion goes off in various tangents with there, but the basis of it is about the that basic communication and kind of getting parents to think about it from their point of view as well, like how do they experience food. So it's a whole big topic that we cover. She also would look at if there's reflux. Sometimes parents will to talk about reflux and things like that, so she gets involved with that.
That's brilliant. How do you go about supporting families to develop their neurodivergent child's diet and sort of range of foods they're comfortable to eat? And also, just a side question, is it something you find does get easier with some of them?
So when they come for our service, everyone, as I say, fills in a food diary. So that has 2 uses for me. So obviously I send it to my dietitian, who'd look at it from a nutritional point of view. So we would support, it's very realistic to the children we see. When he's not going to look at it and say, oh, you need to get them to eat oily fish 3 times a week, because that's just ridiculous. That's not going to happen. So he would look at it from, so if he was worried about, say, lack of calcium and they're eating yogurts, he might say, oh, have 2 yogurts a day to get your calcium up. Or he might look at a supplement, and there are so many different supplements out there, because I know that's obviously an issue, like to just take a tablet or whatever. So we kind of look at that. So that's his role within that food diary. And for me, it's looking at the sensory foods that they're eating now. What are they eating now, and what's going to be easiest next? And that's kind of what I'm helping the parents to understand, because most parents will come and say, oh, I want my child to eat a variety of proteins and fruits and vegetables. But if they're not eating any vegetables right now, then you have to kind of think of the sensory needs of the child to think about what might be next. So you kind of look at the diet, what they're eating now, how can I maybe expand that range of foods. So if they're eating pasta but only eating penny pasta, can I get them to eat other white pasta? Then I might look at have a coloured pasta or something like that. If I want to get a vegetable in, I'm not going to start with boiled broccoli if they've got nothing that resembles that in their diet, because that's just going to be too hard. I'm just going to stress them out more. Or if they're eating like a dry beige diet, which is quite common for kids we see, then I'm probably going to start vegetable-wise with, say, making a parsnip crisp. You know, it's going to be dry, beige, crispy, a bit sweet. So they're going to be more motivated and less scared to explore that food than the broccoli, for example. So it's about understanding the child's sensory needs. That's the key, really, and looking at what are they eating now and what's going to be the next easiest step. And we just want new food in, really. We're not going to say, like, eat a load of sweets or anything like that, but it's about getting them used to and the confidence that they can eat a different food, and making that easy, really. And also, I think helping parents to understand the sensory environment as well. We talk a lot about that, because, you know, if you've got a heightened sensory system and you're finding meal times quite an anxiety situation, you want the sensory system to be dampened down. You don't want that high arousal. So yeah, you want the environment to be friendly as well. So, you know, calm and quiet. And yeah, some houses are very busy, and, you know, it might be busy things on the wall even that's quite distracting. So I think parents forget that sometimes. It's easy, you know, you've got a lot on, and it's easy to forget about looking at all that. So I think knowing your child's sensory needs, talk about being a kind of sensory detective, really, regarding the food, and thinking from that point of view.
I think a lot of our listeners can relate with putting our child in front of a screen, because I know with my son, when he comes home from school, he needs to just sort of go into his own little world, and you feel this massive amount of guilt that you're giving them food whilst they're watching something. But I find sometimes that's the best he'll eat, because he's not focusing on what he's eating, he's focusing on the program, and I can sometimes get more into him. Is that something that you see a lot as well?
Yeah, we see screens used a lot, and I think it's always a very tricky situation.
Contentious, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. There's pros.
You're not on your own, Amy.
There's pros and cons to everything, isn't there? If a child is definitely so anxious that the only way they can eat is in front of a screen, then of course they'll have a screen. You know, if we were worried about weight and we really want to get food in, then of course we're going to, like, you need to get this food in. So, but children go to school and quite often don't eat with a screen, and can eat in other situations with a screen. So we would gradually try to encourage them to eat without a screen, but in a very gentle and gradual situation. So there's no hard and fast rule that it's incorrect or correct or whatever, but you have to know your child, and it's about what you want long term as well, really.
Yeah. I think sometimes it's used in desperation. You mentioned about, like, the long term, but sometimes, I mean, so my son is generally a pretty good eater, but my nephew my sister's had quite a few challenges with his diet and the range of food that he's prepared to eat. And, you know, I've seen the anxiety that causes, and the frustration within the whole family of just, you know, trying to manage that. And I can see how, you know, when you're desperate for your child just to eat, you'll almost do anything.
Of course you would.
Yeah, of course you would. You know, you've got so much going on, haven't you? Yeah. And that's our basic instinct. I've got to feed my child. The path of least
resistance.
Yeah. And if I don't feed my child, then what am I? You know, of course, that's going to be anyone's thing. You know, I've been there. I had issues with my own children eating. You know, I've done all the things that I would tell parents not to do now. You know, I used to tell my husband, because he wasn't entertaining my son enough to feed him. You know, so, you know, I have lived that experience, and I know how hard it is. And that's why we support parents doing things very, very gradually. I would never say, like, cold turkey. And I think part of the anxiety is when you're faced with food that you are struggling with. And yes, when you're in front of a screen, you're not thinking about the food. You haven't got to look at it. You probably haven't even got to listen to it being chewed or anything like that. It's just going in. And as long as you don't mind the feel, because obviously the feel of food is quite important as well, then you're probably, the feel and the taste, you're probably going to eat it. But then maybe when you're faced with that same food outside of a screen, you're like, well, I'm not eating that.
Yeah,
because you haven't kind of understood about that food while you've been eating it. So, yeah.
We do that classic thing where you put a few bits of cucumber on the plate and feel like you've nailed motherhood.
Yeah.
Like, yes,
there is a green vegetable.
Got some green veg in him. That's
yeah.
A couple of grapes made my day.
Yeah. And I think there's so much out there as well, especially with primary age children, about healthy eating and 5 a day, and just adds to everyone's stress.
Yeah.
So we're kind of like, a dietitian would talk to parents about like not worrying about that. Your important thing is to get calories into children. We need them to eat food to grow, and we can work on the other stuff. And that's why we would recommend supplements to start with, to kind of help whilst we work on the food. So yeah, I think eating is one of those things everyone's got an opinion on as well, isn't it? Like people don't tend to give you opinions on everything about parenthood, but eating, everyone thinks they've got a right to give you their 2 pennies worth. So
eating and sleeping, I think.
Yeah,
things
exactly.
that everyone loves to talk about. Yeah, and that causes lots of stress, I guess, all that pressure that I guess we put on ourselves, but also you feel like other people are potentially and actually are putting on you. What's your advice for parents who are finding their child's eating habit stressful?
So I think the thing is, you know your child best, so you do have to, and I think it's really helpful sometimes to write down all the things that your child eats, because quite often it's more than you think. So people will often ring me and say, my child doesn't eat anything. Well, they do, because they're alive, Let's just think about that. And because people kind of dismiss packet food, like, oh, that's just junk. But a lot of food within those packets will offer nutrition as well. So I think, looking at all those foods, writing them all down, because sometimes you forget as well. We get into the routine as well. It's easy to keep giving the same foods as well, because you forget of everything they eat. So I think have a look at that. As I say, you would be that sensory detective, and once you've written it down, look at those links. Is there links between those foods? Okay, I can see they like dry, beige, crispy foods. Okay, so the next food I need to be thinking about is something else that's dry and beige and crispy. And you kind of got to park that, I've got to offer 5 a day, or I've got to offer healthy foods all the time. Yeah, that's your ultimate goal, but you've got to put those stepping stones in place. So kind of give yourself a break, really, and think, okay, right, yeah, I'm going to work to that. But like I say, if I'm giving a parsnip crisp, it's still a vegetable, like all you've done is add a little bit of oil to it, which is a healthy fat. So it's fine.
Yeah.
So I think finding those ways around, listen, don't, it's easier said than done, isn't it? But I think you've got to find your tribe in life, haven't you? I know when my children were little, we had lots of difficulties. So, I've sort of made friends with other children, people whose children were also difficult. So, you've got that support rather than judgment, really. Yeah. So I think that I think don't worry about, because another thing that comes out that parents worry about a lot is sending in packed lunch. A lot of parents will say to me, oh, I'm going to try school dinners, but the school dining rooms are not the nicest place on this planet. They're often, from a sensory point of view, it's overloaded. They can, depending when the child goes in, they can be noisy, they might be a bit dirty, it's quite smelly. And school's not really the time to be working on new foods, so I would be sending in packed lunch, and if that's packets of stuff, it's packets of stuff. You want your child to eat. And I hear too many parents who say, like, oh, I want them to eat these foods, so I'm sending them into school, and then the child doesn't eat, and no one wants to go a whole day with no food.
No.
So you need your child to get through the school day, and they need to be able to function. So if that means sending in packets of hula hoops or packets of what's it or whatever it is, just send it in and let them eat and be relaxed, really.
Yeah,
I needed to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's hard as well, because the schools obviously have, they want to encourage, healthy eating and stuff. So I know particularly in my son's school, all the snacks are fruits and vegetables. So they will literally give them both snacks are fruit and veg, and that's all that you can send in. You can't send in anything over and above that. But it will be like they'll give the child a carrot, just a whole carrot to eat.
Yeah.
And they're little. And it's like, I get it. But at the same time, that's just not realistic for some children. And I also know that there's a real link between my son being hungry and his attention span and his and his behavior and everything else. And when he's hungry, everything else has a knock-on impact. So food is a really important thing. So yeah, 100%, they just need to be able to eat, don't they?
I needed to hear that.
Comes down to schools not understanding enough to kind of just seeing it as like, oh, so many times you hear, if they're hungry, they're going to eat. But the children that we see, they're not going to eat if they're hungry unless it's a preferred food. So I think that whole kind of like, you just need to offer it to them and they're going to eat it. Schools need to understand, really. So I would encourage, and I know sometimes parents are worried about telling school because of that judgment, but I think it is really important to sit down with school and explain your child's diet and what you're doing, and actually they can't access those fruits and vegetables. Sometimes it's helpful, and again, we kind of encourage parents to do this on our courses, is like to sit down and eat some food and close your eyes and really think about what's happening. Like, eating a big raw carrot, some children love it because it's nice and crunchy and crispy, but some, that's going to be such an overload. It's massive, it's big, bites, it goes into little bits, it leaves off juice, that's quite a big thing. Sometimes it's easy, like, are there some vegetable crisps you could say, you can buy packets of vegetable crisps and things like that. Sometimes dried fruits are easier than fresh fruits. So, if your child's eating those, even if they're eating those bear paw things, they've got a bit of fruit juice in them. So, sometimes that's a link that schools will accept. I think, having that discussion with school, because like you say, no one wants to go hungry all day. I certainly couldn't work a whole day with no food.
No, thanks again, because we're at a point where they've said to us, like, he's eating some of the meals because I choose what he eats because he can't decide for himself. So he's eating some of the meals, and I know the ones he'll definitely eat, pizza and chips, of course. And then there's some that I'm putting down and I know that he probably won't eat it. And then they're saying, oh, when we're doing sensory activities, he's like nibbling on the old dry pasta, running off laughing. And I'm like, well, he's probably hungry, because if he's not had lunch. So that's really made me think, actually, that maybe it could even be possible with Alex's school that maybe some days we do packed lunches on the days that I know that he probably won't have the lunch, and then he's still getting the experience of the lunch as well. But no, I needed to hear that, so thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of schools now will let you mix it.
Yeah,
it's worth asking for that. Yeah,
because also it affects sleep. I mean, that's another thing our listeners will relate to, is that if your child's not eating enough, they're not going to have enough sleep, and of course that's quite anxiety fueling. So you just cook what they'll eat, which then means that they're not, it's not varied. But like the point you made, well, if they're getting something and it's you're getting anything in them, then that's a bonus, isn't it? So
yeah, exactly. And then I always think, like, how would you feel if you came to the meal table and on there is just a load of food that you think looks disgusting? You're going to feel really stressed, aren't you? And you'll be like, well, why am I here? And you're going to, as a polite adult, you might push your food around the table, but as a child, you're going to be like, well, I'm not coming. And I see that at very young children, they start even getting into the high chair. It's like, I don't want to go in that high chair because every time I go there, there's this horrible stuff that you put in front of me. So if you do have to give your child their preferred food, because they have to eat and they have to have calories, but there's lots of ways you can also work on the food as well outside of that.
Definitely. So this is a new terminology for me. Is it pronounced ARFID, or do you say ARFID?
ARFID.
So this is something I haven't heard of before. But if you're thinking about whether your child is either a fussy eater or has ARFID, what are the key differences between the two?
Okay, so ARFID, it stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. So it's quite a long term. And it has to be diagnosed by a medical practitioner, usually a clinical psychologist. Okay. So it's relatively new in this country. In America, I think Americans tend to be ahead of us with a lot of things, but or it's more talked about over there. So it is relatively new over here. So I think it's usually only the child would eat a very limited number of foods, so often less than 10. Okay. So that may mean that they've got quite severe nutritional deficiencies. Yeah. And they're going to need supplements to support. And they avoid foods due to its sensory properties. So as we talked about already, the sight of food, the smell of it, the feel of it. So it tends to cause a real disgust response. So these are the kids who might gag or vomit on the sight of food, or so they don't want to sit next to anybody eating because the smell and even the sound can be really off-putting. So then those children are the ones that would usually avoid social situations. So I've got a couple of children at the minute who they won't go to friends' houses for tea. They'll go round to play, but then they don't want to stay for the tea. And one boy in particular is getting quite stressed because he almost doesn't want to go round to play now because he's worried he's going to be offered food. So they tend to avoid food situations really because it's so stressful. Then so it can be quite brand specific. So relying on a specific brand, if that brand changes, then the food will get dropped. So again, quite often at Christmas, you might see food that's got maybe, I don't know, a Christmas tree stuck in it or something like that. And then children will drop it because they rely on that brand to identify that the food is safe.
It looks different.
Yeah. So then if you've changed the food, if you change the brand you must have changed the food inside. So therefore it's going to taste different or it's going to feel different. And I don't know how I'm going to eat that food. So those things get dropped. And you'll quite often see a real lack of interest in food and eating. So kids will say oh, they're not really hungry. They don't really ask for food and they don't really want to come to the table. And those kids would go literally starve themselves rather than eat non-preferred food. So I think the key thing is that it's that severe reaction to food. It's that severe fear and sort of coupled with that nutrition deficiency that comes along with having such a limited diet. And then children with ARFID quite often have other quite high levels of generalized anxiety. So you quite often will see they're quite anxious children as well. And I think the fussy eating is still, it's sometimes now that's almost not considered as stressful for parents or not as hard, but it's still life impacting. So I don't think we have a definite oh, this is fussy eating, it's not the same criteria, but so I think that it's still restrictive and it's still life impacting, but you probably don't get the extreme avoidance that you get with the ARFID. That's the kind of key difference as I see it. That's certainly in my experience. If I've got a child with ARFID in our group, then they're the ones who I might put the food down and then move away and so or they might gag or that kind of thing. So much more severe.
It's really fascinating actually, and we were contacted by one of our listeners. Someone called Ellie has contacted us, and I'll read it out if that's okay for you, Jaqueline, because it's linked to ARFID. So she's asked the question, how do I know if my child is a fussy eater or whether they have ARFID? Obviously, you've touched a little bit on that, but she's given some context. She said, I have seriously considered if he has ARFID in the past. He is scared of even looking at some foods, let alone putting them near his mouth. He won't eat a food because it might be too hot or cold, grey, mushy, etc. She says she's heard it all. We've had safe foods become not safe because it's touched a pea, for instance, and now that's a food that's totally off the list. How do we not feel guilty about feeding our child beige food every day because he would starve if he didn't have it?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm an OT, so I can't diagnose. So
yeah, of course.
she would need to go to see a medical professional if she's looking for that diagnosis. And I think it's important. You need to look at all the background information as well. Is there a medical condition and all those things? You need to look at the food diary, get that analysed, because again, as I say, you'd be looking for those deficiencies. So whether it's ARFID or not, but I think, I can't say that for definite. It does sound quite severe. And I think it's back to that, if you have to give a beige diet, you have to give a beige diet. And then you look at extending that beige diet maybe into like white foods and things like that. So kind of going down a bit of a colour line as well, but also thinking about if he doesn't like anything mushy, then they're not the foods you're going to try and work on.
Yeah.
You want to start at a point that's useful for him, really, and his diet, and then gradually work towards those messier foods. But maybe some children may always struggle with like casseroles and mixed textures to those extreme. They're like, as parents, they're our greatest dishes, aren't they? We all love our kids to eat one pot dish. Yeah. But for the children that I see, they're their worst nightmare because, it's a sensory overload. You look at it and you're like, okay, what's going on in that? There's too much going on. I can't really understand it. So we always work on individual foods first before we would try and mix them. Cooking with children is a great way to get them to understand food, about how it changes, looking at the different aspects. Once you sit a child down at the table, they kind of know whatever age really, as I say, and you get like babies who are doing the ironing board impression because it's like, I don't want to go in that high chair, and so kids know when they're sat at the table, the expectation is they eat. So working on the food away from meal times is where I never work with children during a meal time because, they're hungry, they need to be able to eat, they don't want me mucking around with food. So it's understanding the context of when to work with them. But at home, definitely get them in the kitchen, do some cooking, because you're usually side by side. You can chat to them, there isn't the pressure. They can learn about herbs and spices and smells by just like, oh, can you hand me that basil? Let's tear it up, stick it in the dinner kind of thing, without saying, smell basil kind of thing. So I think there are ways that you can work with it that's low key at home.
That's really interesting. So basically, if someone has a concern about ARFID specifically, they need to go and see their GP.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic.
And sometimes you've got to push a bit because again, it is relatively new.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would go along with like a food diary. This is, maybe do a food diary for a week. This is what they're eating.
That's really helpful for listeners. Yeah. Yeah, because I think we're all fairly familiar with the pushing that you have to do to get any kind of support. But anything that you can kind of do to, as preparation for those appointments helps kind of reduce the, delays that then happen. And when they then ask you to come back with more information, etc.
Yeah, and I think that there is a tendency to often be weight-led. So children with ARFID can still grow and, they can still, because, they're eating a lot of what they like. So I think going with a history of like the social side as well, like, we can't eat together, or he refuses to go in the bakers, or, all those social experiences that have been difficult as well. I think it's good to write those down and go with that. So you've got examples as well.
So helpful. So what would be your top 3 tips you would share with parents of fussy eaters?
I thought about this quite a while. I could have written loads. So I'm trying to narrow it down to 3. I think, remember your mum, and you kind of know your child best, and you have to work at your child's pace. Okay. And I think, I'm probably going to say way more than 3, but
that's okay. That's fine.
You have to go at your child's pace. You have to kind of, as I say, be that sensory detective. Think about the sensory aspects of the food that they're eating now, and think, oh, actually, I'm going to try and work on those types of foods first. I would avoid bribing, punishing, rewarding with food, because again, we quite often talk about that, don't you? If you eat broccoli, you can have your chocolate, And all you're doing is probably extending that hate of broccoli, because if it wasn't for the broccoli, you'd have your chocolate. So you're not creating a love of broccoli by doing that. So, yeah. And also think, move away from this is like healthy, this is not healthy. We talk to children about there are thousands of foods in the world, and there are some foods our body needs each day and we need a lot of, and there's some foods we don't need so often. There's some foods that we need to eat to access a social situation. So I want children to be able to eat pizza. Seems to be the food that's at parties at the minute. So we work quite a lot on pizza, because I want the children to go to a party. I want them to be able to eat chicken nuggets and chips, if that opens social doors for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also for families, you want to be able to go out and order something off a menu. Well, if your child can eat chips and pizza and nuggets, you can usually get something kind of thing. So yeah, and I think make food fun as well, because I think when you're struggling with a child on a very limited diet and there's all that judgment and you're judging yourself and other people judging you, food becomes a chore rather than kind of something that to be enjoyed. And I think it's also easy to forget that most children are good eaters. They may eat a limited diet, but what they eat, they do eat well, and we forget to kind of tell kids that. And I think it can be ingrained in them that I'm not a good eater, I'm a fussy eater. And sometimes I'm trying to unpick that when a child is older, because it become quite ingrained. So I do encourage parents to see the positives of the child's diet as well.
Yeah, they're all really valid points. Before we go into how people can get in contact with you, because I'm sure there's going to be many people after this, after listening, we've had one more question from Katie. She says, my little girl is very sensory. She's constantly asking for food. She can have her dinner and 10 minutes later is wanting more. I've heard that it can be because her body isn't knowing when she's full. If so, how do I get her out of this? She has her usual meals, but is constantly snacking. I'm forever getting food for her.
So I think you need to keep to mealtime routines, okay? So we tend to say, like, most children would have 6 eating times in a day. So you think you'd have your breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, potentially supper. Not everyone needs supper, but you don't want your child going to bed hungry. So if you need to give supper, give supper. But you want to leave a clear 2 to 2.5 hours between those eating times, because otherwise children don't learn to feel their sense of hunger and hunger. If they're constantly grazing, you're constantly taking the edge off their appetite. So when they sit down to a meal, they just have a little bit, and then it's not because I'm not very hungry, because I've been grazing. So then it carries on, really. So trying to keep to those structured times, so as well, like, okay, so lunch is finished, all right, I didn't eat much, but in another couple of hours we're going to sit down and we're going to have afternoon snack. So that there's these set times that you're going to sit down and offer food, so you shouldn't worry too much if they didn't eat one meal. So it's always best to try and reflect over a week rather than sort of meal to meal, and certainly at the end of the day. And let's say you've got your supper in there as like a mop up. Some children that are wanting food, sometimes it can be boredom. Most children know if I ask for food, I get mummy's attention. So is it boredom? Is it fulfilling another sensory need? Like, could she be doing some blowing activities instead, if she's looking for that oral stimulation? So things giving that sensation, but not through food. Doing some blowing activities, or having a drink and using a bottle, like a sports bottle that's quite hard to suck, or like a curly straw so you're kind of getting that sensory feedback that way. I think a distraction as well, because sometimes that 2 hours between, or 2.5 hours, sounds like a long time. So sometimes you've got to distract. Oh, mummy's just, let's play this game, then we'll have something to eat, and then gradually building it up that way.
That's a really so this has been so useful for me, because I have a child that will eat all day. So Max will eat. His appetite is insatiable. So he'll eat his meals, and I mean, like, his breakfast is like a tapas of food. He'll eat all of it generally, but it's one thing after another after another. And as soon as he wakes up in the morning, he says, I'm hungry, and he literally needs to eat immediately. And he will just ask me consistently throughout the day for snacks and eat his meals.
Oh, really?
He has 3 meals. Yeah. And I just don't know if he has just a huge appetite and he's just getting really hungry, or whether it's a sensory thing or a boredom thing, like you were saying. I don't 100% know what's driving it, but yeah, he would eat all day long.
And is it school age?
He's school age, and he's so slim. He's so slim.
Okay. And is he at school? Do you send a snack in? Does he have a snack?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And has an additional snack that I've managed to sort of organise through, because he has an EHCP. So we had a review, and I was explaining to them that, because they were saying that his behaviour drops in the afternoon, and I was saying he's probably tired, but he might also be hungry. So he has alongside his fruit or vegetable, he has like some cheese, just so it's some protein to fill him up a little bit more. But yeah, as soon as he comes out of school at 3:15, I have to have literally snack there, and he will walk maybe to the gate, and then he will stop and he'll have to eat the snack, and then he'll eat dinner.
Well, it's good that he's eating it all.
Yeah.
But
like you say, it might be the type of food as well. Having a bit more protein might fill him up a bit more. And
yeah, maybe. But it made me think when you were saying it, is it something else? Is it boredom, or is it sensory kind of seeking? He's quite orally sensory talking. So
I mean, sucking and blowing and things are quite calming.
That's really useful. And
the water bottles are great.
Yeah, the water bottles is good. And thinking about the snacks being more crunchy, giving him that as sort of. So he might like the raw carrot.
I think he probably would like the carrot, but
yeah. So thinking about the foods I do give him, have I given the sensory kind of food as well that gives him that
input?
Yeah, and just putting things like ice in his drinks at meal times sometimes can give that extra sensory stimulation as well.
Really useful. So, Jaqueline, how can people get in contact with you? Because like Amy said, I think that probably people will be thinking, yeah, I really do want to, understand more about this. And for some people, they might not have even realised that there was help out there. They might have felt like they were just kind of on their own. So how can they get in contact with you, or, understand a bit more about what's involved in one of your programmes?
So you can have a look at our website, so magnificentmunchers.co.uk. They can email me, so that's either do inquiries at magnificentmunchers.com or Jaqueline@magnificentmunchers.com, or they can call me on 07591 733 420. And then obviously I'm on social media, Facebook and Instagram. Fantastic.
Yeah, brilliant. What's your handle on Instagram?
So it's just Magnificent Munchers.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jaqueline. It's been really, I've learned a lot from it. I think Amy, obviously, you mentioned that. So I hope it's been really helpful for those listening. And thank you for doing what you're doing, because I think for like you were saying, for a lot of families, it can actually be life-changing to sort of better understand their child's diet and just lower that anxiety and stress around food.
Okay, no problem. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.